Hey, Captain Chris Myers, Central Florida Sight Fishing Charters. If you're getting knots in your braided line, then this video is for you. Thanks for tuning in today. Please subscribe to this channel for all my fishing tips. And if you're getting knots in your braided line, there's a few simple things that you can do to eliminate almost all of them from occurring again. So I've seen them happen over and over during my many years as a fishing charter guide, and the same couple things cause all the knots. So we're going to go over them step by step. The very first and simplest thing you can do is get in the habit of closing the bail by hand at the end of every cast. So instead of flipping it closed by the handle, and what I've done to my reels is I've taken out the trip mechanism so you have to flip it by hand. It helps people in the heat of the battle that might not remember. You don't want that knot popping up at the worst possible time. Doing that saved me tons of time picking out knots and cutting away and throwing away line. The second thing we want to do is to always maintain the line on our spool tight. So whenever we're retrieving this thing, we have to have tight line going back on. That means the line from the tip of my rod to my lure, bait, hook, whatever you got on there has to be straight. And if it's not, here's some things we can do to make sure that it is. Number one, we want to cast in a straight line. If we're casting in an arc where my cast goes way up high and falls down and all that line drifts on down, you're going to be turning the handle, turning, and the only thing you're going to be doing is reeling up a loose line while the lure or the bait sits still. A simple thing, here's how you can check to see if that's happening to you. Make your regular cast. So my lure is going to land now. Close the bail. You can already see this line is going to loose here. It's drooped down all the way from the tip in front of the camera. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. Now it started moving. I think this is a 6-to-1 or at least a 5-to-1 retrieve. That means this thing went around, put 50 wraps on there before I ever got tight. Keep doing that during the day. It's going to come back to a point where all of a sudden all those loose wraps jump off and make a horrible knot. And you notice most of the time those knots occur when your lure is way out away from you. That's because that's when all that loose line was there. You reeled up the loose line, it's buried down in there. Now my lure gets tight, I'm retrieving tight line. When it gets to those loose wraps, they all want to come off at once. Then if you can't pick that out, you got to cut away a ton of line. So we don't want to be having to cut away braid and throw it away because it's expensive. And if we're filling our spools up all the way, you can see how full this spool is. It casts easily. Light lures go out with a very long distance, but because it's so full, it's easier for the wraps to jump off that spool all at once. Got to be very careful with a full spool that we're following these rules. So cast in a straight line. And if you find yourself with your rod in this position where it's parallel to the ground behind you, it's extremely hard to throw in a straight line going out that way, and it's very tempting to throw way up high in the sky, which is going to lead to tons of slack line. So if I'm going to throw overhand, I'll only bring the rod up just barely past 12. A lot of times I'm throwing sidearm. You might get a little bitty arc in it, but we're going to talk about addressing that in this next step. But if we're throwing a long distance, just a little bit of arc. So now that we have our cast going in a straight line, the next thing we want to do is be sure no extra line is coming off this spool after our lure or bait lands in the water. Several different ways that happens. One is just the simple momentum of the line coming off the spool. The lure lands, line still comes off. So I still got a few feet of line came off after that lure landed in the water. A second way that line comes off, and it's very common, when the wind starts blowing, if we cast and we have a side wind, so it's either going this way or this way, and I'm not doing anything, that wind will blow and blow, pull more line off. Your line's in a big arc, and then as you start turning the handle, nothing's happening to the lure, you're only retrieving slack line. And the third way can be if we're fishing in a place that has current, we throw out, we don't do anything, current can continue to pull line off our spool. None of those are going to be good. So we want to make sure that the second our line lands in the water, that we have a tight line. Now, I'm going to do that one way, and I'm going to show you another way that will work just as effectively. My preferred way is to use the finger that's holding the line when I cast to stop the momentum of my lure just as it's going to land in the water. Even if I have a little bit of arc on my cast, stopping that lure, the lure keeps moving, pulls the line straight and tight. I begin my retrieve, I have a tight line, and I didn't let any more line come off the spool. So that's going to look something like this. I stop the line, come up here, close it by hand, get on my handle. My line is perfectly tight from the tip of my rod to my lure every single time. It's going to take a little bit of practice because you want to stop it a little too early, and then the lure will be jumping back towards you. When you get it just right, you can actually even slow it down just as it's going to land if you want, and it'll pull it perfectly tight and land exactly where you wanted it to. Now, that little trick's also handy when we're fishing around rocks, trees, any kind of structure or fish, and we see our cast is going somewhere we don't want. That's the same technique I use to stop it from going in the wrong place. That's my brake. But every single cast I make, I'm stopping that with my finger. In order to do that, you can't be the caster who lets go with their cast and is holding your reel like this, because now you have no way you can see the line. The wind is still blowing line off my spool here. Now my line is way out here to the right, where my cast went way over here, as the wind continued to blow that stuff off. So now, switch hands, close it. What I would try to do if I saw that slack, raise my rod up as high as I can, get it as tight as I can, and get that slack out of there. But if you're letting go with your casting hand, you cannot control that line, because technique number 2 is, instead of using that finger, we're going to use our non-casting hand. We're going to use that cast to help in the beginning down here on the bottom. I'm grabbing the line, grabbing the spool, flicking it closed all in one motion, come right down here onto the handle. So this is going to, again, prevent line from coming off. One, stop, turn on the handle. Doing those two things will ensure that your line is perfectly tight as you begin your retrieve, and you won't get those knots when your lure is way out away from you on those last few wraps, where it's where the first ones you put on the cast before come off in a big mess. So the final thing is, we have to keep our line tight as we're bringing it back to us. So no matter whether we're using a lure or a bait, we need to make sure that as we're retrieving line, it's tight from our tip to our lure. So I'm just going to go over a lure real quick. If I am retrieving this lure, I would twitch it, freeze, then I reel back forwards. Twitch it, the line's tight, it's still tight, it's still tight, it's still tight. The improper way would be to twitch it, move forward, then retrieve, because I'm throwing slack into my system. Not only will the line constantly jump around my tip, and if that's happening to you, you can be sure that knots will follow, because not only is it wrapping your tip, it's putting line loose on your spool as well. So at regular speed, when I'm retrieving something, I twitch, turn, twitch, turn, twitch, turn. Stays tight. And little twitches will help it stay tight better than big long pulls, which make it very hard to keep that thing tight. So whenever we're retrieving, it's got to stay tight from the tip to the lure. So we put all that together. Our straight cast, don't let extra line come off the spool. Keep it tight while you're retrieving. Close the bail by hand. You will eliminate almost every single knot. Now, if you have lots of line, super light line, using super light lures, every once in a while we all get lazy and a knot comes off. But usually, if you're careful, you can pick them out, and if they're still partially on the spool, what I like to do is loosen my drag up a lot, pull the knot this way, and a lot of times they'll pull out instead of flipping the bail open, pulling off a whole bunch of line, then trying to untangle it. If that doesn't work, then we have to use a much more difficult method, and sometimes you can't get them out at all. But most of the time, if you're nice and slow, you can get them out. But we want to prevent that knot from ever getting there in the first place. And following these few simple techniques will help you prevent almost all your braided line knots. So thanks for tuning in. Hope this tip helps save you some money and wasted braided line. If you have any questions or ideas for new videos, put them in the comments below for me. If you come visit Orlando or Central Florida, give me a call for a saltwater inshore fishing charter all the way from New Smyrna, Daytona down to Cocoa Beach.